Good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to the next project conversation number 21. Today, we are having we're going to have an amazing conversation with Dr. Matthew Clair, who is a professor at Stanford, who is writing a seminal work that will be out in November, dealing with criminal justice and the African American and Black community and class. We oftentimes are very anecdotal in the data we present, dealing with the criminal justice system, dealing with policing, but his research, I believe, is going to be a resource for us as we deal with the long-term impacts and implications of things coming. Matt, how are you doing today?
Doing all right. You know, I'm sure I'm doing just as well as about everyone else in the country at this moment, but I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. Can you tell people a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, a little bit about your research as we get it kicked off?
Yeah, so my name is Matthew Clair. As you said, I got my PhD from Harvard, where I did most of my dissertation research, which is in the book that you mentioned, Privilege and Punishment, How Race and Class Matter in Criminal Court. So I spent a lot of time observing criminal court interactions. I spent some time with defense attorneys as they engaged with their clients behind closed doors. I spent some time in a public defender's office. I also interviewed scores of defendants as well as prosecutors, public defenders, of course, and judges. So that's sort of what I did during my graduate school career, as well as a little bit after graduate school when I was at the University of Pennsylvania. At the school there, I was on a postdoc, and I went back into the field in Boston and did some additional data collection. And now this is the end of my first year here at Stanford, and it's been a rocky and intense year. Not Stanford at all, just nationally.
Yep.
You know, it's been intense, sort of guiding students through this process.
So I know that your research was important because you put five or more years into it. What surprised you about the research? What conclusion and what finding in year 5 was something you didn't expect at year 1?
Yeah, so one of the biggest surprises of the research was sort of the way that sociologists, as well as criminologists, have characterized working class and poor people, generally, the way that they interact with institutions, but also specifically with the way that working class and poor defendants interact with the legal institutions.
Wow.
What surprised me was I found that, so the sort of standard narrative is working class and poor people tend to not really understand institutions, really develop sort of institutional knowledge and have trouble navigating institutions because they're not aware of how institutions operate or function. And what I found was that working class and poor people in my study are actually quite aware of legal rights that they should be afforded. They're aware of Fourth Amendment protections. They're aware of certain criminal procedures that they should be able to use and advocate for during criminal court, such as motions to suppress or dismiss evidence. But the problem that in the criminal legal system, at least, there's a devaluation of people self-advocating for themselves.
Wow.
Criminal court officials don't like that, right? And also there's sort of an understanding that the criminal court system or criminal court officials sort of believe that, these defendants sort of have a misunderstanding of legal expertise or legal knowledge. They don't really understand what their legal rights are.
Oh, wow. Wow. So you're saying people are very knowledgeable on their rights, but the court discounts their knowledge to support the system.
Exactly. So, and the discounting happens in a couple ways. So sort of this understanding among legal officials, and there are unwritten sort of norms or rules about the way court procedures work that actually is not very available to the ordinary person, because the ordinary person who's not a legal official isn't dealing with cases, hundreds of cases every year, isn't dealing with the same judge every year, so isn't aware of sort of how a judge interprets reasonable suspicion or probable cause for an arrest. But there's another way that it sort of manifests, and it's sort of a silencing and down of people who try to speak up and try to explain what happened.
Okay, so let's take a step back. What are some of the norms that you found that the average person going into a courtroom, even if they had the book knowledge, don't have the contextual knowledge? What is that?
Yeah, I think people are often surprised when they go into court. They think, okay, I'm going to be ready. I'm going to have all of the reasons and sort of extenuating circumstances behind what, is alleged that I did. I'll become surprised with often how quick certain aspects or elements of the criminal court process are, how there's very little time afforded to people to be able to speak. I think victims also experience this as well. People who are victimized by crime also are often surprised by actually how much their voice is not really credited unless it's helpful for a certain prosecutorial argument, right? And so I think that's sort of a surprising thing that people often find when they step into court, unfortunately, if they're unfortunately in that position, that it's really about lawyers talking to one another and saying official statements of actions that have occurred.
Okay. Wow. That's got to be disheartening to people. So basically, the payment of the lawyer is what drives the legal system.
In many ways, yeah. So, I think that, there can be sort of beneficial interactions with public defenders. I think public defenders are wonderful on average. They are people who tend to be, on average, more committed to social justice and equality. Of course, they're super overworked. They have a lot of cases. Their caseload's much higher than sort of the average privately retained lawyer. Also, there's sort of a cost to them sort of advocating too much for their client. And the cost comes in with respect to the repeat interactions that they have with prosecutors. If they advocate too much for one client, then maybe a prosecutor will punish them in their representation of another client.
Wow.
Payment does matter in certain ways, but it matters in kind of in ways that aren't too obvious.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about like some of your other critical findings in this? Because like this is so illuminating to me, because there is this idea of a presumption of innocence, but it sounds like it's more a presumption of context and system that determines the result than your innocence.
That's true. Yeah. So, I mean, I think, when I speak to people who've been in the system, I think they often do readily admit, yeah, I probably did something wrong, but it was difference in how the police record sort of articulates what I did wrong, or maybe they planted evidence, right? And so, yeah, maybe there was some wrongdoing, but the way that the system is describing that wrongdoing is inaccurate or wrong, and so they find it problematic. And so I think, system actors, so these are people who are legal officials like prosecutors, judges, and even public defenders can be pretty cynical. They can think, there's probably something that someone did wrong, even though there's technically a presumption of innocence. So it's sort of, the process is very much about coercing people to sort of admit fault in the correct way, to coerce people to accept the characterization of their behavior that the court, that the police record is articulating. And we see this a lot, obviously, with the high rate of guilty pleas. That's the ultimate form at the end of the day of someone being coerced into accepting the record as articulated by legal authorities.
So here goes a question for you. We're talking about police reform, and we're going to talk. You had some really great points on it that I want to get back about spreading the footprint, shrinking the footprint that we talked about when you were on the commission council that I run. But tell me, how do the police play into this system? And is their input really a determinant, or is it just part of the action of the wheels of a bigger process?
Yeah, so I think policing is huge here. I mean, policing, that's the entry point, right? We wouldn't have the cases that we have without what the police do, how they interpret the law, how they sort of use their discretion with respect to dealing with crimes that are on the books, but that are sort of low-level order maintenance crimes, people jumping over turnstiles, things like that, trespassing, et cetera. These sort of low-level crimes that really, it would be great if the legislatures across the United States would abolish these laws, but they do afford police the ability to step in and, sort of shuttle and push someone through the system who they find to be a nuisance of some sort, who businesses might be annoyed by, who sort of quote unquote upstanding citizens might be annoyed by. And so, I think the police are huge here and they play a huge role. And, there's a lot of good research showing that there's a lot of racism and class bias among policing practices, who they target, communities that they target and surveil. And then once someone is sort of slotted into the system, the police record sort of maintains itself throughout the process. So first, sort of at arraignment, when someone is sort of charged with a crime, often in low-level sort of crimes. So these are often in misdemeanor courts where there's a huge load often. Prosecutors often just rubber stamp whatever the police record was.
Wow. Very
little sort of looking, and this varies, of course, by jurisdiction, by DA's office. But
we're talking, there is a pattern across the legal system in the U.S.
Correct. Yeah, there definitely is. And, I think different progressive prosecutors are going to do different things to change this, to decide not to charge certain types of cases, which is truly important work. But on average, there's a general sort of rubber stamping of what the police bring in. There's not really an investigation much into whether there was probable cause for an arrest. Now, at higher level cases, felony level cases, where cases have to be indicted, there is, of course, a grand jury, and there's much more sort of interrogation of what police were doing. But, that's fewer cases than sort of the bulk of the criminal caseload.
And how does the misdemeanor, like, let's say somebody has 3 misdemeanors or 1 misdemeanor, how does that impact when they go back again to court? Does that mark them as a criminal or repeat offender? Does that drive the process? Like, they don't have a way to defend the first misdemeanor. Does it just start adding a snowball to them being stuck in the system?
Exactly. That's the perfect way of describing it. So, judges, when they're sentencing, they're looking at the criminal record. How lengthy is it, right? Prosecutors, when they're deciding whether to be lenient, they'll look at the criminal record, right? They'll say, how many misdemeanors has this person had in the past? How many times have they, been convicted? And when I've spoken to people as part of my research, defendants in particular, who've been through the system, they often regret taking plea deals early on, because then that adds to and they realize themselves sort of the snowballing effect as you beautifully articulated it. And so, yeah, there are also laws, right? There are repeat offender laws, 3 strikes laws, is a way that some people describe these laws. And so basically, if you have 3 types of a criminal charge, then, you can be incarcerated for a longer period of time just because of your criminal record, not because of the specific charge that you were just convicted of. So, this is why we see stories of people who, stole something minor and then they're in prison for a very long period of time. It's often because of 3 strikes laws.
So now, let's take a step back. We're now in an environment where we're talking about police reform, and you're seeing the impact of what police are pushing into the system. What do you think would be some of the significant police reforms that we could do to slow down how people are entering into the system?
Yeah, I really appreciated sort of the Human Relations Council and Commission and everything that we talked about last time. And I'm really eager to see what you all come up with, Palo Alto. But I think in Palo Alto and nationally, and we really need to. I think legislatures in particular really need to consider abolishing certain laws. Therefore not affording the police the legal authority to arrest people for certain crimes. And I think abolition of laws, not just of these sort of order maintenance offenses, but things that morally people do find problematic and on average in America, such as drug use, drug selling and distribution. I think that should definitely be considered. I think many state legislatures have already started abolishing certain laws. I remember when I was in the field, marijuana was first decriminalized, then it was legalized in Massachusetts.
And how did that impact the caseload? How do you think that impacted the caseload, particularly for minority communities?
So there's always the rub there. So often when we abolish these laws or reduce the broader imprint of the criminal legal system, there is often an increase in racial disparities. And so, while on average, and I don't know specifically in Massachusetts, I think there's a study that shows there's actually been an increase in racial disparities with respect to marijuana possession, marijuana. So possession of marijuana of certain quantities is still illegal. And so there is greater racial disparities for marijuana drug offenses with respect to racial disparities in Massachusetts.
Wow.
But I will say, on average, the number of people has been reduced. And so, where, often in states, actually, if you look at the incarceration rates across states that have high levels of incarceration, actually, the racial disparities aren't as intense often. States that have low levels of incarceration. That's because in these states with high levels of incarceration, the carceral imprint of the state has just grown so large that they're taking everybody, right?
They take what they got to fund the system.
Right. So they're not just targeting Black people and Latino people. There's a lot of what I think Michelle Alexander refers to as collateral damage, if you will. So
you and I have had this dialogue already. Can you talk about your on Campaign Zero? You can't wait to abolish evolution of what we would call police reform. Defunding police. There's a lot of things that are being thrown around right now, and it's almost changing daily. So I would love for you to sort of key in on that.
Yeah. So I think the main thing, if I were to say, world, listen, this is the main thing to take away from all of the, as you said, things that are sort of changing daily with respect to specific sort of reform or non-reformist reforms or abolitionist proposals. Main thing I think that pretty much everyone agrees on is, at least who's on this side of reform, is we need to decrease punitive sort of aspects of our legal and increase and invest in resources that we know give people broader senses of safety and security in their lives, such as healthcare, education, housing, renter protections, employment. And so I think that, there are different ways of doing this, and there are different articulations of proposals. 8 Can't Wait, I think, it was unfortunate the way that it was rolled out. I think the people who sort of proposed it have definitely come out and said, hey, when you're talking to your state legislatures, go further than just 8 Can't Wait. I think 8 is a good start, as long as it's not adding resources to departments. It's of course.
Can you stop right there?
Yeah.
Can you talk about the adding resources part? Because I think that's the distinction that a lot of people are not making right now, that we don't want to do any kind of reform that adds to the footprint of police and communities.
Right. Exactly. So adding resources is definitely the key here. Is, so for example, we can think of sort of body cameras, right? And so the implementation of body cameras is super expensive. And this was happening early on in the Obama administration, pre-Ferguson. There was increasing resources to have body cameras, which of course adds transparency when they're turned on. And there are studies that show that they have been shown in some places to decrease the use of force. There are studies that show that. At the same time, we know that they're super expensive. They give a lot of resources to police departments, and they also give police departments as a whole a sort of greater sense of legitimacy when really there's a crisis in policing. And in most places, and with respect to most activities that police are doing, they're actually quite illegitimate as a force in our society. And we really need to rethink their role and their presence rather than just sort of modifying or tinkering with or sort of giving sort of a sense of transparency to the work that they do.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on the camera thing. They also hide a lot of data, because watching, 2 terabytes of video to find a pattern is almost impossible.
Totally. And, it was interesting, I think, in conversations, that we had in the commission, but other conversations generally nationally, it's always interesting sort of the sense that, police sort of say, we have these policies and practices to, to report incidents, right? To a complaint process. And then also, we have a policy or practice where officers on the ground are supposed to report if there was any use of force and how they used it. But we know, and we learned in the commission, that many people experience
Mhm.
violence and they fear reporting it.
Mhm.
Why would you report violence that's committed by an institution to that institution? Right? What's the certainty that that would actually be taken seriously? Especially for people who are routinely surveilled. Of course, there might be sort of a response, right? A punitive response to someone reporting that there was mistreatment or police abuse that they experienced. And then, of course, we know that the process itself often protects officers, and officers are rarely fired, even when they kill someone in the line of duty.
Wow. Wow. Can you talk about some of the alternatives? I think as younger people are going out and saying defund the police, it scares people for different reasons. There's an older group that I think understands the police are bad, but they will say, I don't want to give up my security. They understand, but they don't want to give up security. And then there are others that just think that this is all whatever. But can you talk about some of the alternatives that you've seen, or some of the alternative thinking, particularly around mental health and nonviolent responses and XYZ out there?
Yeah. So, I've spoken to some elders as well, even in my own family, are a little hesitant when I
Exactly
share these ideas with them. But they've come on board actually. And because, I've shown the research, and I've also sort of shared that it's not just defund, it's also invest, right? And it's critical that it's both of these things together. Because investing in communities and community organizations and nonprofits is what's going to be able to make it so that the existence and the things that cause crime are mitigated. So there's been studies. So Pat Sharkey and colleagues, he's a sociologist at Princeton, looked at the sort of increase or the presence of nonprofit organizations in, I think, 200 some odd cities across the United States, and the causal effect of these nonprofit organizations with respect to various indicators of crime. And so increasing the presence of them has a causal effect on decreasing certain forms of crime. We also know that there's another study that shows that, educational programs over the summer help students, not just sort of giving them things to do and sort of staying out of sort of the possibility of being able to interact and do something bad because they're in a summer program, but also that it has long-term effects, or at least longer-term effects as they studied, to a certain degree, of keeping them away from engaging in criminalized behavior. And, I think there are other models too that sort of reduce what we give police the ability to do. And I think a lot of police actually agree with this, that often they don't want to be called to mental health crises. Often, maybe they don't want to actually have sort of, the authority or the burden really of, traffic stops and things like that, and making quotas, et cetera. And so if we outsource these components of police work to mental health crisis responders or a civilian task force of people who, deal with traffic issues, that way we can reduce the imprint of the police, and it's not going to have any effect it's not going to have any effect on sort of a harm of other type of crime, right? So I think there's this imagination of violent crimes and, oh my gosh, it's how are we going to deal with violent crimes, right? But, most of the work that police do is actually not dealing with violent crimes. And in fact, police are so tied up dealing with all of this other stuff that could be dealt with through investments and through alternative sort of institutions that they can't even solve violent crimes. The clearance rate for murders is super low. I think it's nationally like 50%.
High.
Yeah. And so, I think police actually, so if I were to speaking to some elders about this, I'd say, hey, you might think this is scary, but I'm pretty sure actually some police, when you articulate it in a certain way, could get on board. Now, when you talk about getting rid of police overtime, police salaries, that's when police feel sort of economically threatened. And I totally understand that. And I think that's a super big, important conversation that we need to have as well, is sort of the implications of removing jobs. But, I think these are conversations that I'm glad we're having and are super important to be having today.
One of the things that I think has been missing from the conversation but sorry, that has been missing from the conversation, but I feel that we need to talk about is the civilian input to systems. There was a great article in the New York Times where a former mayor from Minneapolis talked about sort of like the deal that white liberals make with the police department to maintain lifestyle. In talking to the Palo Alto Police Department, they say 70% of their calls are client generated. You know, I feel like there are people that and we go down to Amy Cooper, where we have videotape of people weaponizing the police to because of people's presence. How do you? I know that it's a more complicated issue, but is there policies on the police end? We talked about this. I wanted to have a charge for making a false report, and you said I don't want to increase the police anymore. But tell us what your thoughts are on that space.
Yeah, so after that conversation that we had, where I was like, no to the Karen Act, Caren Karen Act in San Francisco, where it increased sort of a punitive presence by sort of punishing people who, like an Amy Cooper, who misuse police. I've thought a little bit more about it, and I still agree. I don't support it. But I will.
You made me think. Also, I'm not as.
Yeah, and I'll say I think you're right. Though there needs to be some form of informal or formal social control that makes racism not something that people feel like they should invest in and perpetuate. I think that's right. And I think conversations around cancel culture, for example, that's a great way. And I think people have issues with cancel culture and are worried about it. But let's be real, right? I think the harms of canceling someone, are not as big as sort of the harms of people experiencing racism in their daily lives. And people are never really truly canceled, are they? I mean, yes, lost her job, but I'm sure she'll get a job later on in her life. I'm sure she'll be just fine. I disagree with her being prosecuted because I think that she's already sort of dealt with some of the sort of social norms that we have around racism and racist talk and sort of deputizing the police in your own way. I will say there's an interesting blog post that I have yet to read, but I encourage anyone who's watching it to read because I know this scholar is brilliant. Her name is Monica Bell, and the sociologist at Yale Law School, and a legal scholar as well. And she has recently written, I don't think it's a blog post actually, I think it's an article in The Appeal. Again, I have yet to read it, but I think it's an alternative way, as she articulates, for us to deal with racism. And just from the sort of title that I saw on Twitter briefly, the way is to sort of think about sort of non-criminal justice aspects, maybe communities coming together in some way to maybe, I don't know exactly what it is, so I don't want to speak on it, but I encourage your watchers to sort of look up that piece by Monica C. Bell in The Appeal.
So, I think public shame is going to be a big part of this moving forward. And I think social media is helping. It has many negatives, but it's one of, I think, the positives, because the reality is I've dealt with it in Palo Alto where people are weaponizing the police force to deal with the presence of people they don't feel should be in their neighborhood. Not because they've done somebody falling asleep in their car is not a criminal offense. If I go to my car and go to sleep at lunch, I shouldn't be woken up with the police knocking on the window.
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly what started the movement for Black Lives, right? Martin was a victim of this, was a victim of someone who said, oh, look, here is a young Black boy, he doesn't belong. And I'm going to sort of not only just call the police, but I'm also going to articulate and envision myself as a police officer with a gun. And it has deadly consequences. And so we do need a system to be able to disabuse white people of the idea that they should be doing this, that they have the sort of entitlement to do things like this. And, I can imagine sort of maybe a civilian process or a civil legal system process to this, something about maybe monetary damages, things like that, that don't involve just increasing the imprint of the criminal legal system and then putting people in jail and prison, which often is criminogenic in itself, right? Being and living in a carceral space can often increase criminal behavior, and it separates people from pro-social resources and their jobs, their families. So I think often Black people historically have always had to sort of have a more humanistic approach and be more willing to sort of, forgive, et cetera, et cetera. And I hate to add to that narrative, but I think that is the way to go generally, is we as a society need to be more forgiving, more loving, more protective of people, and more encouraging of people doing positive things rather than just punishing them when they do negative things. As Brian Stevenson says, we're more than the worst thing we've ever done in our lives.
Wow, that's a great way. We're at the end of our time, but is there one thing you want to leave the audience with? I think what you just shared with us was simply profound, even just in the beginning where you started talking about the criminal justice system and some of the norms and things, is even information that's going to equip people as we all have family members and people in our communities that deal with this. But is there anything else you want to leave us with?
Pastor Smith, I just want to thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in Palo Alto. I don't know, sort of the community of people who watch the show, I'm sure is broader than Palo Alto, but, say when I first arrived here, sort of thinking, it's sort of this idyllic place, nothing goes wrong. And I was really saddened to hear a lot of the stories of police abuse and violence. I just want to encourage all of your listeners and everyone to, no matter where you live, really start to investigate, look into what's going on, not just in Minneapolis, not just in New York City, not just in Chicago, what's going on in my local community with respect to police violence and abuse. Back to the court system, encourage people to go to the courts, go watch the courts, go listen to what's happening, and just be sort of engaged citizens in their local communities, not just nationally. But thanks again for having me on, Pastor Smith. And,
I think Todd Bryant, who's in Atlanta, says it best. We need African-American scholarship on this and these issues. So thank you so much for the work you do. Everybody, his book will be out in November. Can you tell them the book? Where can they get it? Because we need to support Africa. And let me tell you guys, when people create academic works, they're not $10 books.
This is true. I think this one is maybe $29.95.
$8 to $35 is worth it. We were talking, my good friend Joshua Bennett. Being Property Once Myself, it's a $35 book, but the more we buy, the more their work will be able to be sold at a larger price, at a lower price because of scale. So let's support our Black academics or Black writers.
Thank you.
Tell them about the book, sir.
So the book is Privilege and Punishment, How Race and Class Matter in Criminal Court. You can get it anywhere where books are sold. You can go on Princeton University Press's website, which is the publisher, to look at it. You can also go to IndieBound and support local Black bookstores. So anywhere where books are sold, you can find the book. It's coming out in November, but you can pre-order it right now if you'd like to.
I'm going to pre-order it today.
Thanks. So I really look forward to just continuing the conversation, hearing people's thoughts on the book, but also getting the stories of the people who I spoke to sort of on the record, right? Because one major thing about being part of the court system is you don't get your story on the record. You don't get your version of events on the record. And I'm really excited for the people that I got to know, for them to get their stories and explanations and terrible encounters, but also hopeful visions of the system on the record.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us for the Next Project Conversation. Dr. Matthew Clair was amazing today. We will see you next Thursday at 12 p.m. As usual, we will continue to bring you some of the best minds in America as we navigate through these challenging times. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Bye.